Ask a devout Latter-day Saint how many people leave the church, and you'll hear a number. It's almost always wrong, not slightly wrong, wildly, catastrophically wrong. Here's the strange part. The data that proves it didn't come from a critic. It came from a faithful returned mission president, a man who spent his life defending the faith, who set out to understand why people leave, and instead documented the one thing the leadership has spent decades trying to frame as a personal failing rather than an institutional one. Over 11,000 people, 40% former members, 60% still believing. The largest study of its kind. And buried in that data is a gap so wide it should stop every bishop in his tracks. Because what active members believe about the people who leave and why they actually leave are two completely different stories. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just the real reasons people walk away, but who wrote the script that taught the members to misunderstand them in the first place. And it's not who you'd expect. Part 1. The retention. Illusion. Let's start with the number, because the number is where the illusion lives. The book is called Torn. Its author, Jeff Strong, is not an enemy of the church. He's the kind of member the institution holds up as a model. Faithful, committed, a former mission president. And that's exactly what makes his findings so difficult to dismiss. When Strong asked the most devout members to estimate how many people leave the church, roughly 3 out of 4 dramatically underestimated it. They pictured a small trickle, a handful of the weak, drifting off at the edges. Something manageable, something rare. The reality sits somewhere between 50 and 75%. Depending on how you measure activity and belief, half or more of those raised in the faith do not stay. Sit with that contrast for a moment. The most engaged members, the ones teaching lessons, running the wards, raising the next generation, are operating on a picture of reality that is off by an enormous margin. They think the ship is sound. The data says it's taking on water faster than almost anyone inside will admit. And here's the open loop I want you to hold on to. This misperception isn't an accident. It isn't just wishful thinking. By the end of this video, I'll show you exactly how you were trained to look at a sinking ship and see something perfectly fine, and why that training points straight at the top. Part 2. The stories members tell when you underestimate how many people leave. You also have to explain the ones you can't ignore. And this is where the narratives begin. Ask an active member why someone left, and the explanations arrive in a familiar shape. They wanted to sin. They got lazy. They lost the spirit. They were offended by someone. They got caught up in the things of the world and let go of what mattered. And here's what should unsettle you. These stories aren't just coincidences. They're nearly identical across thousands of wards, in different states, different countries, from members who've never met. That kind of uniformity doesn't happen by accident. Later in this video, I'll show you where that script actually comes from, because someone taught it, deliberately, and it wasn't the person sitting next to you in the pew. For now, notice what every one of these explanations has in common. They locate the failure inside the person who left. The individual is weak, or selfish, or deceived. The institution is never in the room. The doctrine is never questioned. The history is never the problem. The problem is always the person who walked out the door. It's a comforting story, if you're the one staying. It protects the believer from having to ask whether the person who left might have had a reason worth taking seriously. It turns an uncomfortable question into a moral verdict. The trouble is, when Strong actually asked the people who left why they left, almost none of them described the story the members had written for them. Part 3. The real reasons, in waves. Here's what the data actually shows. Strong organized the reasons people leave into waves, and the first wave is the one members least expect. Church history, 42%, the single largest driver. And I want you to picture who this actually is, because it's not who you were told. This isn't the lazy member. This isn't the one who wanted to sleep in on Sunday. This is the gospel doctrine teacher who studied his way out of a calling. The seminary graduate who opened the Joseph Smith papers expecting to have his faith confirmed. These are people who encountered the documented factual history of the institution, the parts that quietly contradict the version taught in Sunday school, and could not reconcile the two. They didn't stop reading their scriptures. They read too much. The second wave is social, members leaving over the church's positions on cultural questions, most sharply, its treatment of the LGBTQ+ community. And again, picture the person. This isn't rebellion for its own sake. This is the mother who watched what happened to her gay son. The lifelong member who looked at how people she loved were treated, and could not square it with the gospel she'd been taught. For many of them, leaving wasn't a loss of conscience. It was an act of conscience. The third wave is experience inside the church itself. Around 18%. No sense of belonging, no place at the table. This is the convert who was surrounded on baptism day and forgotten by the second month. The single adult in a family ward who never quite fit the mold. People who showed up, gave their time, and slowly realized no one would notice if they stopped. And the fourth wave, the smallest, is lifestyle, around 6%. The people who genuinely struggled with the rules, the demands, the daily weight of it all, 6%. Hold that number because it matters. Because look at what the members did. The story they tell centers almost entirely on that smallest slice, the sinners, the rule breakers, the ones who wanted an easier life, and treats it as the whole picture. The largest category, the one about history and information, barely registers in their imagination. They've inverted reality. What drives most people out? They can't see. What drives out the fewest? They've made the entire explanation. So now you know why people actually leave. But that raises a far more uncomfortable question. If the data is this clear, if the real reasons are this well documented, why does the average faithful member still stand up and say it's about sin? Why is the gap between the myth and the reality so perfectly, so consistently wrong? The answer is the part they don't want you to understand. You weren't just misinformed about the numbers. You were handed a script. Part 4. Who wrote the script? This is where the podcast hosts add the observation that reframes the entire study. Strong's framing suggests that members invent these false narratives on their own, that this is a human reflex, the natural way people cope when someone leaves their group. And there's truth in that. People everywhere protect their beliefs by finding fault in those who abandon them. But the hosts push further, and the push matters. Members didn't invent these stories in a vacuum. They were taught them. From the pulpit, in lesson manuals, in conference talks that get quoted for decades. The exact vocabulary: losing the spirit, being offended, wanting to sin, being deceived by the world, seeking after the philosophies of men. That language didn't bubble up from the pews. It came down from the top, and it was repeated until it sounded like common sense. Think about how efficient that is. If you're leading an institution and people are leaving in large numbers, you have two options. You can examine whether something about the institution is driving them out, or you can teach the people who stay a ready-made explanation that places every ounce of blame on the ones who left. One of those options requires you to change everything. The other requires you to change nothing, and it comes with the bonus of making your remaining members feel spiritually superior for staying. Guess which one gets preached? So the blind spot from part 1 isn't a bug in the members' thinking. It's a feature of the system. When a faithful member tells you someone left to sin, they may sincerely, deeply believe it. But they're reading lines. And the author of those lines was never the person in the pew. It was the institution that trained an entire culture to read every exit the same way, as the fault of the one who left, and never the fault of the ones who stayed. And this brings us to the single most damning number in the entire study. When a faithful member finally hits a real crisis of faith, the system has an answer for where they should go. The bishop, the stake president. These are the men positioned as shepherds, the ones meant to catch you before you fall, the divinely appointed safety net. According to Strong's data, just 5% of those conversations were experienced as positive or productive. 5%. Let that sit for a second. In a system that describes itself in the language of shepherding, of watching over the flock, of leaving the 99 to find the one, the shepherds are failing 95 times out of 100. And here's the contrast that makes it worse. The same people in crisis reported that talking to a friend went far better. Talking to a spouse went far better. More warmth, more understanding. More room to be honest about the doubt without being managed, corrected, or treated like a problem to be solved. Think about what that means structurally. The very channel the institution built to retain its doubting members is the channel that fails them most reliably. The people trained and set apart to represent the church are the least equipped to sit in a hard conversation about it. And so the doubter quietly learns the lesson the institution never intended to teach. The organization has no real answer for me. Only the people who love me, apart from the organization, do. That's not a retention system. That's a filter. It quietly moves people toward the door while congratulating itself for holding them back. Step back and look at what this faithful researcher actually assembled. A membership that can't see how many are leaving. A set of comforting stories that blame the people who go. A reality where the true reasons are history, conscience, and belonging, not sin. A leadership that authored those comforting stories and taught them from the pulpit. And a pastoral system that fails the doubting 95 times out of 100. The most powerful thing about Torn is its source. This didn't come from an opponent. It came from inside the tent, from a man who wanted to help the church keep its people. He held up a mirror, and the reflection showed an institution that has misdiagnosed its own crisis so completely that the people most devoted to it are the least able to understand why it's losing members. And here's where I want to be fair, because this matters. If you're an active member watching this, the point isn't to attack your faith. The point is honesty. The data didn't come from someone who hated the church. It came from someone who loved it enough to look at the truth without flinching. That's not an act of apostasy. That's an act of integrity. And the real question this study leaves behind isn't whether the church is true. It's whether an institution that claims to seek truth is willing to look honestly at what its own faithful researcher found. The data is faithful. The conclusions are hard to escape. The only question left is whether anyone with the authority to change things is willing to look into that mirror, or whether it's easier to keep blaming the people already walking out the door. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's really happening inside the LDS Church, subscribe, because we take the data, the history, and the stories the institution would rather you never connect, and we lay them out honestly. And I want to hear from you, especially if you're still active. When you or someone you love left, what story did the members tell about it? And what was the real reason underneath? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one.